Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode in the YouTube Philosophical Pessimism series. This one will be again about antinatalism and specifically the deontological foundations for my particular antinatalist argument. Essentially, the question for this episode is going to be about what makes the antinatalist argument distinct from other moral or ethical arguments, and what makes the decision to not procreate a distinction that is not special pleading or cherry picking, but actually makes sense for why it is in a category of its own that is different than other ethical considerations after someone is already born. So the decision to procreate prior to someone's possible birth versus after they are born. What are those distinctions? That's what this kind of is covering. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so first let's start off with the groundwork, the foundation of the ethics for this particular argument is going to be a deontological one, somewhat based on Kant's idea, Immanuel Kant, his idea of not treating humans as a means to an end. According to him, because humans have dignity and inherent value, by doing something that is using them, that would be violating their dignity and violating and disrespecting their value as a autonomous, rational being. And so he implores us not to use people as a means to an end. That would be morally wrong, according to him, because you would be disvaluing, you would be disrespecting someone's moral worth, because rational beings have inherent, infinite, absolute worth, and by doing something that violates that dignity or that worth, you are violating this ethic. And I believe that's a good basis to start any ethics that is not something that's kind of utilitarian or virtue-based. And I think that this really does capture what is going on intuitively when we think of people and not using them as a means to an end, or relativizing things based on some sort of outcome you want to get from people. You're actually looking at people, as agents, and I think that's why it should start from there and not possibly some utilitarian arguments which may in a way use people to get to a certain outcome, thus violating this intuitive idea, moral intuition of not violating someone's dignity and worth. And so that is the place to start. And of course, procreation itself can be considered, without even any other things having to add to it, is that by putting somebody into the world without their consent, they're not going to be alive beforehand to be able to do that, would be something that with other things, like say, doing something on behalf of somebody, would be considered a violation because they didn't have a choice in it. You were violating their autonomy. So it's clearly on the face of it, prima facie, that would be a violation of this principle of using people, just on the face of it, without even going any further. But you can also say, but I'm kind of going to make an argument that it's not just that you are doing something without someone's consent, but also that you are creating unnecessary harms on someone's behalf, and that, without knowing who that person is or anything about that person, just on the face of it, doing that on behalf of someone, I'm going to call that quote-unquote aggressive paternalism. That is going to be the thing that is the major violation of procreation. And by the fact that before someone is born, there is no other consideration you have to think about with that person. So if you are to think about a person as a full autonomous being with dignity and worth, and have their own ends in mind and have their own goals and values, well, that person doesn't exist prior to their birth, obviously. So the only considerations as a potential parent would be that you are preventing the suffering, the unnecessary harm that could come about from your actions. Because by doing that, you are violating that principle of the worth of somebody. You're using them. You want to get something out of them, whatever that might be. A child, like that relationship, you want to see them grow and do things. You want some ends from them, but you're using their harm, their suffering, their pain to get this ends up coming about. So that's really kind of the gist of this argument. Okay, so let me kind of just step back then. If that's the full argument, then let me kind of like get piece by piece this together. So with that in mind, let's also keep in mind, so there's the principle of not using people and they're, because people are their own ends and they have their own dignity. Along with that, it's kind of entailed in that idea that people have dignity and worth and value, is that they're also autonomous. So you should not be doing things that would force them into a situation which they may not have wanted. And of course, again, that goes back into procreation brings about things that someone, if they had prior knowledge, might not have wanted. So that also comes into this. So that is also a violation. Not using people and the autonomy people, procreation violates both of those. Okay, now let's kind of bring in the idea of David Benatar's asymmetry argument, the famous asymmetry argument in antinatalism. And so when it comes to people not existing, there's an interesting asymmetry that forms, and the absence of pleasure for somebody that doesn't exist doesn't create a problem. It's not bad because there's no one to be deprived of that good in the first place. So the absence of pleasure does not matter. And what does that really imply? That really implies you have no obligation to create a being that experiences pleasure if they don't exist in the first place, because there's no bad that's happening to any person from that. So you need to have a person in the first place that would have needs and wants, and you would have to know who they are and what you're depriving and what they would not want, what they would want. And that's not any consideration when you have the case of prior to birth. So keep that in mind. Now, here's where the very controversial statement I would say is the absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anybody. So he's saying that unlike pleasure, which does matter, that there has to be a person that exists for whom that can be a deprivation, you don't need somebody to exist for this to be a good thing. Now, the addendum I would make to this particular one, the second bullet point there, is that if you looked at my prior video, I discussed this. There does have to be a person in the world for this to obtain. If there's nobody that has any ethical considerations in the world, there's no animal with sentience, somebody who can do something to somebody with a moral decision and be the subject of a moral decision. If there's no one like that, like in other words, no animals that exist in the universe, then this doesn't matter, and it's kind of a category error to even think about it that way. So somebody does have to exist to recognize this, for this to obtain. But if there are people in the world that can recognize this does obtain. So a potential parent can recognize that, it is good that something does not exist that could have been existing to be suffering. And so they are preventing that scenario from coming about. And that is a good thing, because that is the only consideration that you should have prior to birth. You don't have a person who has goals and ends and worth or dignity, because they don't exist yet. But the dignity that you can consider is the fact that you are not imposing a harm onto somebody. That is what matters. Because pleasure doesn't matter for something that doesn't exist, but it does matter that you could be causing unnecessary harm as the person who is the instigator of that. And that is really... that it makes intuitive sense. Do not cause unnecessary harm. And if you do cause unnecessary harm because you want to bring about pleasure, and here's the real interesting thing, you are violating that Kantian idea of not using people as a means to an end. And so you are maybe using that person by creating harm for that person knowingly and limiting their choices of things knowingly, because you want to see something else come about. And that would be a violation of someone's dignity. So that is really, in my opinion, where the power comes in this asymmetry, is it combining Kantian's idea of not using people with the Benatarian asymmetry, but also keeping in mind that the addendum that you have to have somebody in existence to recognize this. It doesn't just obtained as true unless there are people that this matters for. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so procreation violates, and we just discussed this, violates the dignity and autonomy principle of Kant, right? And before the unique situation prior to birth is that you can perfectly follow this principle of not violating dignity and autonomy by not procreating. In other words, entailed in the principle of dignity, of treating people as ends and not using them, is the principle of non-malfeasance, which means don't do harm to people unnecessarily, essentially. You don't want to bring about more pain in the world to somebody when you don't have to. There's no reason for doing that. Do no harm. Principle of autonomy, again, not doing something, not forcing something onto somebody or deceiving something onto somebody that would normally be able, they can't, if they can't make a decision on something, you are making that for them. That is also a violation. So what is happening if you don't follow that perfect duty that you can absolutely follow prior to birth? If you don't follow these perfect duties, what's going on? Well, I'm calling that aggressive paternalism. It's the notion that, the presumption that you know what's best, and you are okay with causing harm to somebody else and violating those things because you think you want to see something come about. As the parent, you want to see, X thing from this child come about, whether it's status of being this, or you want to see the experiences played out for somebody else in life, and whatever it is that you want, to come about from this child being born, you are okay with ignoring the fact that you are doing unnecessary burdens, unnecessary impositions onto this person. That is what I will call aggressive paternalism. And kind of, so the argument against this goes, hey, that you can follow the perfect duties of respect and of inherent worth and dignity of all rational beings. You can follow those, and again, not harming people, the principle of non-malfeasance, the principle of autonomy. But if you don't follow those, if you do go ahead and procreate, now you are violating those principles, specifically by creating unnecessary impositions. Again, those impositions and burdens violates the non-malfeasance, the non-harm and autonomy principles, and you are disrespecting, you are not valuing the dignity of someone by creating this and going ahead and ignoring these things. And what specifically are these unnecessary impositions? Well, I did talk about it in the last video, but I'm going to go over it again. Do not assume unnecessary impositions of conditions onto others. That's that aggressive paternalism. And what are these things you're assuming others should be able to like or should deal with and be burdened with in life? Well, the parameters of choices in the world that we must choose from and encounter. This world, this universe, this existence has only a certain amount of choices that we can choose from. You grow up thinking, oh, I can, be a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. I can do whatever I want to do. Well, that's not, those choices are actually pretty limited choices with the physical, not just work stuff, any stuff really. I'm just using those as an example. But the physical, cultural, social aspects of the world are limiting what you can do in them. So within this society, within this physical, material, physical setup of this world, you can only do XYZ type of things, and you can't get beyond that. Well, maybe you would never have wanted those things if you were to have a choice prior to existence to have that, but you are now limited, and somebody else made that decision that these choices of this world, what this world has to offer, is good for you, and that you would like these choices, and now you have to deal with them without great harm to yourself to get out of it. Things like suicide, of course, and things like to get out of this world. You can't get out of it easily, and so here you are stuck with these choices and this setup of this world because someone aggressively thought that this was good for you, and again, using you and violating that dignity principle. The amount of known harm that is acceptable also. The parent thinks that they know that there's harm in the world. They have experienced it themselves, whether it's illness or loss or frustration or every manner of thing. And if you looked at some of my prior videos, we discussed the different kinds of suffering. The inherent suffering or the necessary suffering of the Eastern variety, right, the Schopenhauer variety, that we're always striving and we can never fully get a fulfillment, and we're never attaining, and we're striving all the time and never completely satisfied. And, there's certain anti-frustrationist ideas that by procreating, you are violating the dignity of somebody by creating for them automatically things that will be they will have to want, desire, seek out goals that they can never fully get, and always have to continually be trying to fulfill these ever expanding desires and goals and things that are just entailed in life. That's one harm that is known. Another known harm would be the contingent harms, the ones that, well, maybe not everyone has all of them in the same way or in the same intensity or things like that, but they certainly do happen to most people, whether it's illness or whether it's loss, whether it's all the any little things of life that annoy you, all the way up to the very big things, that are extremely bad. So those are known harms. So someone decided those things, those unnecessary impositions that did not need to happen for somebody else will happen to them. That again violates the dignity and autonomy principles there, and the idea of non-malfeasance. Okay, and then there's the risks of unforeseeable harms. So maybe the parent doesn't know exactly all the harms that will befall someone. They didn't even think about things that might actually occur, that they were just never really dawned on them. Oh yeah, this could happen. Well, you are presenting those risks onto somebody, again, playing with somebody's life, violating that dignity principle. So all of this could be perfectly avoided in prior to birth. You can perfectly prevent unnecessary impositions onto another person that consider, and again, as agent-centered, we're not looking at a grand benefit the greatest amount for the greatest amount of people, whatever. That would not be a consideration in this deontological argument, because deontology is generally agent-centered, because we are valuing that individual's dignity rather than using them as some sort of they're just a number on a calculation on how many things would weigh better benefits and things like that. No, we are saying that you do never, for that particular person, impose on them if you don't have to do that. And prior to birth, that is the case. You do not have to. Okay, so just don't act on that. That's all this is saying here. By not acting on those aggressive paternalistic assumptions for somebody else, you are not doing the violation. You can follow the perfect duty to respect somebody's worth and dignity. You will not harm them, so you're not violating the principle of non-malfeasance and autonomy. So just don't do that, and don't let the violation take place. Now, what happens if it does take place? Well, once born, we are no longer in the realm of perfect duties. Okay, so what does that mean? So the principle of malfeasance still applies. You want to try to avoid as much as you can to not harm people. Okay, that's number one, because that is then violating their dignity by doing that. By just, even if you think that there's some gain that's going to come out of it, even for that person, but by doing something that's violating their autonomy and their dignity like that and using them, you are violating that principle of malfeasance. But this can never be applied perfectly once somebody is already born. Prior to birth, you can follow that principle perfectly, but once somebody is born, now they have interests and goals and their own personalities and characteristics. And so, in a way, solely focusing on malfeasance might actually be somewhat denying dignity and worth, because now you have the principle of benevolent or beneficence coming into play, where you may need to help somebody. Somebody is in danger. You might have to do something, not just a negative where you're preventing an imposition onto somebody. You now have to do something active to prevent a further thing. So you might even be doing something that's violating their autonomy in a way, because you know that this will help them later on. You have to wait. In a way, you're calculating stuff. You're calculating risks of non-malfeasance with benefits and things like that. So although these principles are still in play, it's still now, if you really do want to take the person into consideration, you now have to take what would be their values and how does that fit into non-malfeasance and benefits and things like that. And so it becomes kind of more of a calculation rather than being able to follow it perfectly. It's what I'll call an imperfect duties, where you want to help somebody with their projects, they're helping you with your projects, but you don't have to all the time, but it's always a good idea if they're a friend or if they're somebody in need, things like that. These are just things that kind of come into play, and they could in a way conflict with the non-malfeasance idea of not harming, because you can never fully not be, and this is a really important idea, once born we're in a realm of kind of this not perfect state of always having conflicting notions, conflicting values, and in a way you can never get out of maybe doing some harm in this world of already being born, where prior to birth you could have prevented 100% harm, and so you could perfectly follow that principle doing that. So that's kind of the main difference between the two. The ethics prior to birth, why that's so distinct and different than ethics after somebody's born. I'd like to hear what you think about this. Thanks for listening.